Michael Carter pulled into his driveway after a grueling day in court, expecting the familiar comfort of home to wash over him. But instead, he was greeted by a scene straight out of a bad dream. His private property was jammed with cars parked bumper to bumper, as if his house had been mistaken for a stadium lot after a big game. A man in a tank top leaned casually against the garage door, sipping a soda like he owned the place, while a teenager sprawled across the hood of a blue sedan, scrolling through his phone with an air of entitlement. Nearby, a woman in yoga pants hauled grocery bags from her trunk, tossing Michael a glance that suggested he was the one out of place. He sat there gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his mind racing to make sense of the chaos. Maybe a neighborhood party had spiraled out of control, he thought, but when he rolled down his window and barked, "Excuse me, what the hell is going on here?" the answer hit him like a punch to the gut. "Oh, hey, you're the guy who lives here," the soda-sipping man said with a grin. "Yeah, the HOA turned this into public parking last week. Pretty sweet deal, huh? Free parking." He chuckled as if it were the most normal thing in the world, but Michael's face darkened with a mix of fury and disbelief. He wasn't just angry, he was insulted to his core. He parked on the curb, took a steadying breath, and marched toward his front door with a judge's resolve pounding in his chest, each step echoing like a gavel slamming down, determined to get answers. And he knew exactly who would have them. Just as he reached his house, the architect of this madness appeared. Corinne Whitaker, the HOA president, stepping off her pristine, overpriced porch with a smug smile that could curdle milk, dressed in one of those pastel outfits that screamed neighborhood dictator. "Oh, Michael," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I was wondering when you'd notice." "Notice?" he growled, his tone low and dangerous. "Corinne, why are there a dozen strangers parked in my driveway?" She folded her arms, her grin stretching wider, and said, "Because, Michael, the HOA made some changes. We rezoned your driveway as community parking. There was a vote." He stared at her, the words barely sinking in, and she plowed on. "It was necessary. The neighborhood had a parking problem, and your driveway was just sitting there, underutilized, so I proposed a solution. We even got $500 from the community fund for it." Michael let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the absurdity of it all sinking in like a bad joke. "You sold my driveway," he thought, but she corrected him with a casual, "Technically, we reassigned it," as if she'd just rearranged a flower bed for the garden club. His temples throbbed, his jaw clenched tight. This wasn't just ridiculous, it was illegal, and she stood there acting like she'd done him a favor. He forced himself to stay calm, drawing on years of courtroom discipline because he wasn't just any homeowner. He was Judge Michael Carter. He turned back to his house, stepping over a discarded fast food bag someone had left behind, and stormed inside. But instead of stewing in rage, he grabbed his laptop and got to work. He was going to dismantle this nightmare, and he'd start with the facts. Michael sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face as he dug into the legal bedrock of his property rights. His fingers flying over the keys with the precision of a man who'd spent decades wielding the law like a weapon. The first document he pulled up was his property deed, and there it was in black and white. His driveway was undeniably part of his legally owned land, a fact so crystal clear it might as well have been etched in stone. The HOA had no authority to sell it, rezone it, or so much as park a tricycle on it without his consent. Next, he dove into the HOA's own rules and regulations, scrolling through pages of bureaucratic jargon until he confirmed what he'd suspected. Nowhere did it grant them the power to seize private property, and several clauses explicitly forbade such overreach, branding this reassignment a blatant violation. He leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at his lips as he built his case brick by brick, but Michael wasn't content with just a legal victory. That would take too long, and he wanted blood now, a swift strike to make Corinne regret ever crossing him. The next day, he played a different game, stepping outside with a calm demeanor that belied the storm brewing inside him, watching as more strangers parked in his driveway like it was their God-given right. He didn't argue, didn't yell, just waved at them with a tight smile, letting them think he'd rolled over and accepted defeat. What they didn't know, what Corinne didn't know, was that he'd already set the wheels in motion with a few well-placed phone calls. The first to the city zoning department, where he filed an official complaint about the HOA's illegal land grab. The second to his old law school buddy, a shark of a lawyer who jumped at the chance to tear into this mess. And the third to a local towing company, whose owner had laughed darkly when Michael explained the situation. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, he had everything lined up. The HOA had committed fraud by selling land they didn't own. The city was already sniffing around their zoning stunt, and best of all, he'd found a gaping loophole in Karen's precious contract. It was void from the start, meaning every car on his property was trespassing, plain and simple. He stood in his front yard that morning, sipping coffee as the rumble of tow trucks filled the air like a symphony of justice, watching with quiet satisfaction as one by one, every car in his driveway was hooked up and hauled off. The chaos was glorious, a cacophony of honks and shouts as people stumbled out in pajamas, screaming about their precious vehicles. A woman dropped her smoothie in shock, splattering green sludge across the pavement. The teenager who'd lounged on that sedan tripped over his own sneakers trying to stop the tow driver. And then, like a queen dethroned, Karen stormed out of her house, her face a furious shade of red, shrieking, "What do you think you're doing?" Michael turned to her, cool as ice, and said, "Oh, just enforcing the law, Karen," taking another sip of coffee before adding, "Turns out you don't have the power to sell my driveway, so all these cars, trespassing." He handed her a court order, her eyes widening in horror as she scanned it. This was just the opening salvo, and he was only getting started. Karen stood there clutching the court order, her smug facade cracking like cheap plaster as the tow trucks roared away with the last of the cars, leaving her precious community parking experiment in ruins, while Michael watched her unravel with the calm detachment of a man who'd already won the first round. He knew this wasn't the end. Karen's outraged glare told him she'd come swinging back, and sure enough, the next morning a crisp HOA violation notice was taped to his door, fluttering in the breeze as he peeled it off and read the absurdity. He'd committed an unauthorized removal of community vehicles and faced a $500 fine per car, a penalty so laughably over the top he almost admired her gall. She was doubling down, betting he'd buckle under the weight of her fabricated authority, but Michael didn't flinch. He let the paper sit on his counter all day, savoring the irony as he planned his next move, letting Karen and her cronies stew in the delusion that they still held the upper hand. That evening, he strolled into the HOA board meeting at the community center, a thick file tucked under his arm, and the room fell silent as he entered, board members exchanging nervous glances, while Karen forced a tight-lipped smile from her perch at the head of the table. "Well, well, Michael," she said, her voice syrupy with condescension as she gestured to an empty chair. "So glad you could join us. I assume you're here to discuss your recent behavior." He settled into the seat, crossing one leg over the other with an ease that unnerved her, and replied, "Oh, I'm here to discuss a lot of things, Karen," his tone light but laced with steel. She flashed that sugary grin again, saying, "Wonderful, because we have concerns. Your actions disrupted the community and removed vehicles that were legally parked." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Legally parked? You sure about that?" And when she scoffed, insisting the HOA's vote made it so, he slid his file onto the table with a thud that made the board shift in their seats. "That's interesting," he said, "because according to city zoning laws, private property can't be reclassified as communal space without the owner's consent. And per your own HOA bylaws, any such decision requires a community-wide vote, not just the board's say-so. I never consented and there was no vote, so your decision's not just invalid, it's fraud." The room tensed as his words landed, Karen's face paling for a split second before she rallied. "That's a dramatic interpretation, Michael, but the community needed parking, and the HOA acted in everyone's best interest." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "That's not how the law works, Karen, and unfortunately for you, I've already filed a complaint with the city's housing authority. They're very interested in how this HOA operates." A murmur rippled through the board, one balding man, Robert, clearing his throat to stammer, "Now hold on, Judge Carter, maybe we can find a compromise." But Michael's smile didn't reach his eyes as he said, "I already found one, Robert, it's called justice." Karen gripped her chair, her knuckles white, forcing out, There's no need to get hostile, Michael. Let's revisit this and come to an agreement. But he nodded slowly. I agree. Let's revisit it in a courtroom. She snapped, slamming her palms on the table. You're being ridiculous. But he stayed seated unruffled. Oh, I don't think I know. And as the meeting dissolved into chaos, he knew she'd underestimated him, and that was her fatal mistake. The HOA meeting had ended in a glorious mess, with board members whispering frantically and Karen trembling with rage as Michael walked out, leaving her to stew in the wreckage of her own making. He'd struck a nerve, and now he was ready to turn up the heat. The next morning, he filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA, charging them with property theft, fraud, and mismanagement of funds, his evidence airtight. The property deed, the HOA bylaws, and best of all, recordings from his confrontation with Karen, where she'd smugly admitted to reassigning his driveway for a measly $500 from the community fund. Within days, city officials launched an investigation into the HOA's financial records, and that's when the real filth started spilling out. Karen and her inner circle had been siphoning funds for years, splurging on lavish dinners, vacations masked as HOA conferences, and phantom payments to contractors who never existed. It was a cesspool of corruption, and Michael had just yanked the drain plug. Karen, once so poised and untouchable, spiraled into desperation. Passive-aggressive emails flooded his inbox. Emergency HOA meetings were called to fix the mess. And she even tried rallying board members to offer him a hollow apology, hoping he'd back off. But Michael didn't budge an inch. Then came the breaking point. One morning, Karen stormed up to his doorstep, her usual polish replaced by a disheveled mess. Hair askew, eyes wild, her pastel armor dulled by the weight of her unraveling empire. Michael, we need to talk, she said, her voice strained, and he leaned against the doorframe, sipping his coffee. Do we? She forced a brittle smile. Yes, look, this has gotten out of hand. There's no need for lawsuits or investigations. We can settle this like reasonable adults. He tilted his head, letting her squirm. You mean like how you reasonably stole my driveway? She exhaled sharply. Fine, we'll revert the decision. The driveway's yours again. Just drop the lawsuit. He let her words hang there, savoring the moment, then shook his head. No, Karen, this isn't just about my driveway anymore, and panic flashed in her eyes as he continued. You'll what, lose your position, face charges, pay back the money you stole? Her throat bobbed, fear replacing her bravado, but he just set his cup down with a satisfied sigh. Actions have consequences, Karen. You should know that. She opened her mouth, then shut it, realizing she'd hit a wall. Defeated, she turned and shuffled away, shoulders slumped, no threats or power plays left to muster. Michael watched her go, feeling not just victorious but righteous. This wasn't petty revenge anymore. It was about dismantling a rotten system that had bullied the neighborhood for too long. The fallout hit fast. The HOA board imploded as the investigation deepened, members turning on each other like rats on a sinking ship, cutting deals to save their own skins while homeowners, once cowed by Karen's reign, started demanding answers. The tide had turned, and Michael was at the helm. By week's end, Karen was a shell of her former self, her smug confidence replaced by frantic desperation as the evidence piled up against her. She tried one last plea, showing up at his door again, her voice soft. Michael, this is ruining me. But he didn't blink. You should have thought of that before. And she knew then that her kingdom was crumbling, and he was the one holding the sledgehammer. Karen's second plea at Michael's door hung in the air like a dying echo, her desperation palpable as she stood there, a faded shadow of the HOA tyrant who'd once ruled with an iron pastel fist. But he didn't soften. Years in the courtroom had taught him that mercy wasn't the same as justice, and she'd earned every ounce of what was coming. You don't understand, she pressed, her voice trembling. If this goes to court, I could lose everything. But Michael met her gaze without flinching. That's not my problem. And with that, she let out a soft, defeated whimper, turned, and shuffled off. There'd be no third visit, no more bargaining. She was out of moves, and he knew it. The HOA's collapse accelerated from there, the investigation ripping through their records like a buzzsaw, exposing a tangle of corruption that went far beyond his driveway. Homeowners who'd been fined into submission, overcharged for nonsense fees, or threatened for daring to question Karen's edicts now saw the truth, and their anger fueled a reckoning Michael had only dreamed of igniting. The board, once a smug cabal, fractured as members scrambled to save themselves, pointing fingers and spilling secrets to dodge the fallout. But it was too late. The house of cards was down, and he dealt the final blow. Within days, the neighborhood buzzed with a newfound energy. People who'd lived under the HOA's thumb started speaking out, demanding change, and it came fast. The board was gutted, Karen and her cronies stripped of power and banned from ever holding authority again, while the stolen funds, hundreds of thousands over the years, were clawed back, massive refunds issued to residents who'd been fleeced. Then the state stepped in, slamming Karen with an embezzlement case that stuck like glue. The evidence was overwhelming, her lavish lifestyle funded by dues she'd siphoned off now laid bare, and she had to sell her pristine house to cover legal fees and damages, fleeing the community she'd once lorded over. Michael felt no pity, not even a flicker. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every homeowner she'd crushed, and he'd made sure they all got their due. One evening, as he stood on his reclaimed driveway, watching the last moving truck rumble away from Karen's former palace, his wife Sarah joined him, handing him a glass of wine with a quiet, "It's finally over." He took it with a smirk. Not just over, it's better. And he meant it. The neighborhood had shed its battlefield scars, people smiling at block parties without fear of fines for stepping on their own grass. The absurd rules Karen had enforced tossed out like yesterday's trash. No more penalties for front door colors, no more gouging fees for basic upkeep, no more dictator in a blazer calling the shots. Michael didn't want the HOA thrown himself. He'd had enough of power games. But he'd handpicked the new leadership, a group of honest folks who cared about the community, not their egos, and they'd taken the reins with a promise to keep things fair. As he sipped his wine, he caught a glimpse of Karen a few days later, struggling to parallel park her beat-up car on the street near her new apartment. No assigned spot, just another resident fighting for space like everyone else. She glanced his way, then quickly looked down, pretending he wasn't there, and he smiled to himself. Justice wasn't just winning, it was balance, and this felt perfectly, deliciously even. Michael leaned against his car that morning, watching Karen wrestle with her parallel parking nightmare, her old sedan scraping the curb as she tried to wedge it between two other vehicles, her frustration etched into every jerky movement. It was a small, petty victory, but it tasted sweet, a daily reminder that her reign was dead and buried. She ruled the neighborhood like a petty monarch, her word law, her whims enforced with fines and threats. But now she was just another face in the crowd, stripped of her throne and scrambling for a parking spot like the rest of them. When she caught him starring, she ducked her head, feigning ignorance, and he let her have that tiny dignity. He'd already won, and gloating wasn't his style. The HOA's overhaul had transformed the community in ways he hadn't anticipated. Gone were the days of fear and resentment, replaced by a tentative optimism as neighbors rediscovered what it meant to live without a dictator's shadow. Block parties sprang up. Kids played in yards without some clipboard-wielding lackey nodding violations. And the air felt lighter, freer, like a weight had been lifted off every doorstep. He'd made sure the new leadership wasn't just a patch job. After Karen's ouster, he'd spent late nights with Sarah poring over resumes, vetting candidates who'd never dream of turning dues into personal slush funds. And the result was a board that actually listened, tackling real issues like potholes and streetlights instead of policing mailbox aesthetics. The refunds from the recovered funds hit bank accounts like a collective sigh of relief. Years of overcharges reversed, some families getting back thousands, and the gratitude showed in nods and waves from people he'd barely known before. They didn't call him a hero, but they didn't have to. He saw it in their eyes, and that was enough. Karen's fate, though, was the real capstone. The state's embezzlement case had her cornered, her house sale barely denting the mountain of legal bills and penalties, and word was she'd taken a low-rent apartment across town, a far cry from the manicured lawns she'd once presided over. Michael didn't dig for details. He didn't need to. Her absence was proof enough that the system he'd dismantled wouldn't rise again. One afternoon, as he mowed his lawn, not some HOA-mandated showpiece, a former board member, Robert, shuffled up, hands in his pockets, looking sheepish. "Judge Carter," he started, "I just wanted to say, you did a good thing. Karen had us all fooled, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Michael shut off the mower, wiping sweat from his brow, and studied the man. Robert had been a yes-man, not a mastermind, caught in the undertow of Corinne's schemes, and now he was just another neighbor trying to make amends. "It's done, Robert," Michael said, voice firm but not cruel. "Just keep it honest from now on," and Robert nodded, relieved, before trudging off. Michael didn't need apologies, but he took them as a sign the tide had truly turned. Later, Sarah found him on the porch, handing him a beer as the sun dipped low, and asked, "Think she'll ever come back?" He chuckled. "Not a chance. She's got nothing left to fight with." And they clinked bottles, the quiet satisfaction settling between them. This wasn't just about his driveway anymore. It was about reclaiming a community, and he'd done it, one legal jab at a time. Michael stood on his porch that evening, the cold beer in his hand, sweating against the warm air as he watched the neighborhood settle into a peace he hadn't seen in years. The kind of quiet that comes when petty tyrants lose their grip and people start breathing again. Corinne's downfall had left a vacuum, but instead of chaos, it birthed something better. Neighbors chatted over fences without glancing over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes past dusk without some HOA rule shutting them down, and the streetlights flickered on without a dime of dues vanishing into someone's vacation fund. He'd fought for this, not just for his driveway, but for every homeowner who'd been squeezed by her reign, and the proof was in the small, everyday freedoms blooming around him. The new HOA board was a far cry from the old regime, practical, transparent, focused on fixing what mattered, and Michael had kept his distance, offering advice only when asked. He wasn't here to rule, just to make sure the corruption didn't creep back, and so far it hadn't. Trust was fragile, but it was growing, one fair decision at a time. He'd heard whispers about Corinne's new life, scraping by in a cramped apartment, her old car rattling down streets she used to own, her name a cautionary tale swapped at barbecues. And while he didn't chase the gossip, it found him anyway, painting a picture of a woman who'd lost more than her house. She'd lost her identity, her power, her everything, and Michael couldn't muster sympathy, not after the years she'd spent bleeding the community dry. One morning, as he headed to court, he spotted her again, wrestling with that same parking spot, her face pinched with exhaustion. She didn't look up this time, and he didn't linger. It wasn't about her anymore, it was about what she'd left behind, and he drove off with a nod to the balance he'd restored. Back home, Sarah joined him on the driveway later, her eyes scanning the empty expanse where strangers' cars once crowded, and said, "You know, I almost missed the drama, almost." And he laughed, the sound easy and light. "Yeah, well, I'll take boring over that circus any day." The neighborhood had healed faster than he'd expected. People stopped by to thank him, not with grand gestures but with quiet words, a bottle of wine, a handshake, and he took it all in stride, knowing this wasn't about him being a savior. It was about righting a wrong that had festered too long. The old rules, fines for paint colors, fees for breathing wrong, were history replaced by a simple code. Live and let live, and it worked. The community center, once Corinne's stage for HOA power plays, now hosted potlucks and kids' art shows, the air thick with laughter instead of tension. Michael didn't need to lead it. He'd done his part, and the new board carried the torch, proving the system could work when it wasn't rigged. As he finished his beer, a neighbor waved from across the street, and he waved back, feeling the weight of the fight slip away. Sarah nudged him. "Think we're finally done with her." And he smirked. "She's done with us. That's what counts." And they stood there, the driveway theirs again, not just in deed but in spirit. A hard-won patch of ground that symbolized something bigger, a victory for everyone who'd ever been pushed too far. Michael woke to a Saturday morning that felt like a reward, the sun spilling across his driveway, empty, pristine, his, as he sipped coffee and listened to the hum of a neighborhood no longer at war with itself. It was a quiet triumph, the kind that didn't need fanfare, just the steady rhythm of life unshackled from Corinne's grip. The HOA's reformation had held firm, the new board proving their worth with every pothole patched and every meeting kept short and sane. People showed up now, not out of fear, but because they wanted to, tossing ideas around without dread of a fine or a power trip. The community had scars, sure, but they were fading, replaced by block parties and kids' laughter. The absurd rules of the past a punchline over beers instead of a chokehold. He'd stepped back, letting others steer, but his shadow lingered in the way folks nodded at him, grateful, not reverent. And that was fine. He'd never wanted a crown, just his damn driveway, and in the end, he'd gotten both that and a whole lot more. Corinne's ghost still flickered on the edges. Rumors of her scraping by, her old car a fixture on cramped streets, her name a hissed footnote in neighborhood lore. But she was irrelevant now, a cautionary tale with no sequel. Michael saw her once more, weeks later, fumbling with grocery bags outside that dingy apartment, and she didn't even glance his way, her defeat so complete it didn't need words. He drove past without slowing, the sight a final punctuation mark on a saga he'd closed. Justice wasn't loud here. It was in the silence of her absence, the balance of her fall against the community's rise. Back home, Sarah caught him staring at the driveway and teased, "You gonna put up a shrine to it?" And he grinned, nah, just enjoying the view, because it wasn't about the concrete, it was about what it meant. A line he'd drawn, a fight he'd finished. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was better, freer, and that was enough. People painted their doors whatever color they damn well pleased, mowed their lawns on their own terms, and the HOA dues stayed low, funding things that mattered instead of Corinne's ego trips. Michael didn't miss the drama, didn't crave the spotlight. He went to court, came home, shared wine with Sarah, and let the days roll by, each one a quiet victory. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a neighbor kid zoomed by on a bike, no clipboard tyrant in sight, and Sarah murmured, "This is what you fought for." And he nodded. Yeah, and it was worth it. The driveway stretched out before them, a symbol turned reality, and he felt the weight of it all settle, not as a burden, but as a foundation, solid and earned. Years later, someone asked him about the HOA mess over a barbecue, and he shrugged. Just a guy who didn't like cars on his lawn. But the knowing smiles around the fire said they remembered. He'd taken on a bully, ripped apart a rotten system, and handed the pieces back to the people who belonged here. Corinne was gone, her empire dust, and Michael stood on his ground not as a king, but as a man who'd balanced the scales. The night deepened, the chatter faded, and he looked out at the street. His street, their street, and thought, this is what justice feels like. Not a gavel, not a roar, just home.